This week's case is about an experiment with mice and what would happen if every single one of the material needs were met except for space. So an overcrowding issue. Spoiler alert, it doesn't end well. So let's get started. Hello everyone, I am back finally. My name is Brandy for those of you new here, and it is time for a true crime case or mystery or another story I will explain, along with one or more of my fabulous felines, who of course aren't on camera. If you're a returning subscriber, welcome back, my feline friend, and a big shout out to my feline fans who help support this channel. I appreciate each and every one of you sticking with me while I went through a tragedy when my computer died. So this case today is a bit different from my usual cases, and let me tell you why. So true crime in general is, well, it's always been kind of attacked as being like a genre that people, quote unquote, enjoy, entertainment, right? So while I was off doing research, I stumbled across this program. I don't know what it was. I was flipping through the channels and they mentioned true crime, and I just stopped because I'm like, ooh, it's like a debate. Well, basically, one of the ladies on there said that, true crime in general isn't like a bad thing, right? Okay, it is entertainment. People get entertained by the weirdest of things, right? But she said, why does true crime always have to be like horrific murder or abuse or, some huge tragedy all of the time? There are other crimes out there that don't contain those things, like, Ponzi schemes, financial crimes, businesses being unethical or breaking the law. And I was like, you know what? She's right. I have been focusing more on, the older cases, but some new cases, and it all stems around, murder and abuse and what have you. So this resonated with me, and I began to think about all of the crimes and stories that didn't involve the murder. I mean, have you heard about the great maple syrup heist? Oh my God, what an interesting story. Someone stole 18.7 million of Canadian currency of maple syrup. It's a very interesting story. I will cover it on this channel. But my point is that I'm going to incorporate more cases that don't involve, murder, abuse. Don't worry, I still will do those. But I figured we were going to branch out a little bit. So I started just researching other things, and I found that there's just a lot of stuff out there, and some of it is more historical, but it has maybe a true crime element or a distant true crime relation or a mystery or something like that. And I've already kind of started incorporating like paranormal stories into this channel. So I thought, you know what? Why not branch out and let's talk about Universe 25 today and how it relates to the human race. And in the future, if you guys have any suggestions that are financial crimes, government corruption, just interesting cases out there that may not be exactly true crime, but maybe it's a mystery, maybe it's paranormal, maybe it's, a more kind of funny crime story. I'd love to hear them because I'm going to branch out and cover a lot more stories. I've already updated my playlist, so I have the true crime playlist, which would be more of the murder, bad stuff. I have a paranormal playlist, which only has one video on it right now, but I plan to do more. And I might make a playlist for mystery or like other outside stories, kind of like this one. So we'll see. But anyway, I just want to let you guys know that is my plan going forward. Some stories you may not like, you can skip. That's fine. You guys watch what you like. So, let's get started on this week's case of Universe 25, the Mouse Utopia. So this starts with a man named John Calhoun, who is an American ethologist, and an ethologist studies animal behavior. I probably didn't say that right. I know. Criticize me in the comments if you want to. It's ethologist, right? Ethologist. Anyway, Now, Mr. Calhoun is noted for his studies specifically in like population density in rats and mice. So John, in his studies, had coined the term behavioral sink, and which basically refers to a collapse in normal behavior of a species when like overcrowding is an issue, and it eventually will lead to species extinction according to his studies. So now John had many experiments before his famous Universe 25 mouse Utopia experiment. So in 1947, John had a 2.5-year study where he was studying this colony of rats in a 10,000 square foot like outdoor pen. There were 5 female rats in this group, and potentially they could produce 5,000 healthy rats inside this pen during the 2.5-year study. Now, what John found, though, is, they just didn't populate to the max. They actually never exceeded 200 as a colony, even though the place could fit 5,000. He'd also see that the rats weren't just like running around the pen crazy, not knowing what to do, but they had actually organized themselves into these smaller groups or colonies. And these groups or colonies were kind of 12 to 13 rats. He discovered that any group that had more than 12 or 13 rats really wasn't a harmonious group. And it seemed to cause, more stress and psychological issues in the group. Because of this led to where the rats wouldn't mate, as much or at all. And therefore, the population never reached its max potential. So that was his kind of first dive into this overpopulation theory. So that was kind of his first experiment that he did. Now, in 1951, John had moved back to the States, and he had converted this old barn into a research area. Now, John built like various rooms for separate rat colonies in this barn. And then in each room, he would make like a slight adjustment to something in the room so it was different from the other rooms. And then he would study the effects it had on the rat colony in that room. So for example, in one room, he'd put the nesting box like 3 foot from the floor. In the next room, he'd place the nesting box like 6 foot high in the room. And then in another room, he'd have the nesting box right at floor level. Now, he had little stairs that would go up to these nesting boxes, so it's not like they couldn't reach the nesting box, but each of these seemingly minor variations in these rooms actually resulted in a different behavior from each colony. So that was really interesting. So over the years, John had many of these types of experiments, and he was becoming well known for his experiments, and people began, talking about how this could relate to humans and how humans could overpopulate the earth. And this may be a look into the future of humans, and this happened during the 60s when there was the big baby boom and stuff. So it was a big subject at the time. Now, there was some debate that, professional scientists got together that, overpopulation of an area basically means that there's limited resources to survive. There's limited food, limited water, and so matter, what species is fighting to survive in this overcrowded space, it's going to be chaos because it's like survival of the fittest, right? John disagreed. John stated that overpopulation in itself was an issue, that you could have unlimited amounts of food and water and resources, but the overpopulation itself would cause a behavioral sink in the species. And so to prove his point, he came up with Universe 25, the mouse Utopia experiment. John's intent in this experiment was to show that behavioral sink will still happen when all the material needs of a species is met, but the only issue is overcrowding. So in 1968, John created the mouse Utopia. It was a 9 square foot metal pen with 4.5 foot high walls. The pen had tunnels, hiding spots. everything that a mouse might need, enrichment stuff, nesting boxes, food dispensers, and water dispensers. There was no shortage of food and water, and there was no shortage of nesting material. There were no predators in this Utopia, of course. The temperature was kept at an even 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which, for those of you that don't know, I just learned this as well, 68 degrees Fahrenheit is the perfect temperature for a mouse to thrive. So no harsh weather goes into this Utopia. And extreme precautions were taken to prevent any type of disease from entering the Utopia. So food was switched out regularly to avoid like mold or anything like that. The people who came into the Utopia, they had to be careful that they're not bringing anything in. You can't come in when you're sick, anything that you can pass on to the mice. The water was always fresh. And the Utopia was cleaned regularly of, mouse poop and everything. So this literally was a mouse utopia. It was the perfect living conditions for a mouse. The only limitation was space. But he made the space big enough to accommodate 3,000 rodents reasonably. They'd be a little overcrowded, but not terribly. And he did this for a reason, because he said that the behavioral sink, based on his older experiments, was going to happen before they even reached 3,000. And, spoiler alert again, he was right. So, 4 breeding pairs of mice were initially put into the Utopia. So 4 females, 4 males. And it went well at first, of course. The mice thrived, as you can imagine. Unlimited food, unlimited water, unlimited nesting. Go to town, right? They were happy and they were stable. Since they did not have to spend time like they would in the wild, like foraging for food, water, avoiding predators, in their outside world and everything, they spent their time like you think they would, mating. Now, the colony did double their numbers every 55 days or so at first. So the colony was growing pretty exponentially. Now, at day 315, a little less than a year, John noticed the first signs of a breakdown in the colony. There were about 700 or so mice at this point. The mice started splitting off into their groups of 12 or 13, like his early experiments, which he knew would happen. Now, in each group, there's normally a role to fill and for each mouse. And they found that because all of the material needs for these mice were met, that there was a lot of mice that couldn't find like roles in their colonies, in their groups. So in the wild, if a rat colony gets too large and the mice can't find a role, the mouse will like split off from the colony, migrate somewhere else, either start their own colony, find a colony, and find a role. So they have unlimited potential in the wild. With nowhere to go in this mouse utopia, they can't migrate anywhere else. They're stuck in this, metal pen. So these mice that didn't have a role to fulfill would withdraw physically and psychologically. They'd literally sit in the middle of the pen and did nothing except for maybe lash out occasionally at one of the other mice that were there in the area. But otherwise, they would literally just lie there immobile. So normally, of course, in the wild, mice will defend their territory, especially when they have babies. And although fighting does happen in species in the wild, it's because there's a reason. It's over territory, it's over food, in the real outside world, right? A mouse doesn't purposely seek out another mouse just to start some shit. They don't attack for no reason. And that's kind of what started happening around this year mark. Now, John did note that not only was there an increase in aggressiveness for no reason, but there was also a decrease in kind of the alpha males, where they were no longer defending their territory, and the mothers, the kind of alpha females, were losing their maternal instinct and just sort of abandoning their babies to fend for themselves. So an example is how the nests were built in the beginning versus how the nests were built after about a year in this experiment. Even with plenty of nesting material available, mothers were just losing interest in preparing nests and raising their babies. But even with that decline of not protecting your territory and not protecting your babies, for some reason, both sexes of mice were, some of them anyway, were unusually violent and aggressive for, again, no reason. Females would attack their own babies. Males would just attack other mice for no apparent reason, and would even start to, should we use the word rape, not only the females, but the other male rats as well. It's like they just didn't care anymore. They just went after whatever was in front of them. Now, this aggressive and violent behavior got worse with each passing week. Eventually, when the attacks would result in a death of a mouse, the mice around where that mouse died would resort to cannibalism. And remember, there is ample food available at all times. So by day 600, about a year and a half into the experiment, the rat population would top out at 2,200. Now remember, this pen was built where it could fit 3,000 rats reasonably, where they would be slightly overcrowded at 3,000, but not terribly overcrowded. We haven't even reached 3,000, and this behavioral sink has started. So the last rat was born in May of 1970. After that, the population began to drop drastically. Not only were the females not mating as often or at all, but the mortality rate of the babies was 90% due to, them being abandoned, or they being attacked by their mothers, or males coming into the nest and cannibalizing them. It was terrible. John dubbed this phase of the population the first death, and that means that no new mice were being born or surviving to replace the mice that were dying. Now, along with this first death phase, there was behavior issues that John noticed with some of the mice that were actually completely opposite from violent and aggressive. John noticed that the last 1,000 mice or so to be born actually avoided any stressful activity. And they would spend their day eating, drinking, sleeping, and grooming themselves. That's it. That's all they did. They avoided fighting, procreating, or any social interactions with any other mice. They just focused their attention on themselves. Due to this, John dubbed these mice the beautiful ones, because physically, they appeared as the most beautiful exhibit of the species. They had keen, alert eyes, they had a well-kept body, and a pristine coat of fur due to their grooming. It was believed that because the beautiful ones' material needs were met, they never had to learn how to forage for food or fight for food, because they didn't care about territory at this point. And so those life necessary skills that you would get by living in the wild faded away. And their only focus became on themselves, and they had no instinct to mate either, to save the species, so to speak. So John noted in his research notes that when someone has everything and doesn't have to work for it, meaning they don't have a role in society, this prompts a decline in responsibility, effectiveness, and awareness of social dependence, which then will eventually lead the species to self-extinction. So now the only mice that are left in this experiment are the beautiful ones. They are not mating. They are just minding their own business, and eventually they would die of natural causes, which resulted in the extinction of the entire population in the mouse Utopia. The last mouse died sometime in 1973, only 5 years after the experiment began. John would go on to repeat this experiment many times, and the result was always the same. The population would end up extinct. Now, in some of John's later experiments, when he was doing this Utopia thing, he would remove some of the beautiful ones from the Utopia, and they would place them in a new environment that, one, was stress-free and free from the carnage of cannibalism that was going on around them, and to see if they would snap out of their asocial behavior where they only just cared for themselves, and see if that instinct would come back to them to, repopulate this new stress-free environment. Unfortunately, the beautiful ones never snapped out of that asocial behavior. They kept refusing to mate, they kept refusing to socialize, and again, eventually would just die of natural causes. John would write in his conclusions after these experiments that when behaviors related to courtship, maternal care, territorial defense, and hierarchical organization fail to mature, there is no development of social organization and no reproduction. All members of the population will age and eventually die, and the species will therefore die out as well. So this experiment has been compared to if humans were in the same situation. The Earth is essentially our pen, and eventually, if we keep going like we do, we're going to fill up this pen. Roles in society are very important in humans as in other species, and when roles are filled, this leads to a loss of identity and therefore will eventually lead to a behavioral sink, as John indicates in his experiments. Now, based on these experiments, some scientists, professionals, non-professionals, armchair people, they have said that we've already, as a human species, we're already seeing some of these behavior issues in us already. So they say that, we have more introverts that don't do much, if any, social interaction. So those are known as the beautiful ones, right? A majority of the population has some sort of depression or anxiety disorder. Guilty. It was said that many more men and women, they're choosing not to have children. I'm guilty of that as well. I have no desire to have children. And we all know humans attack and kill each other all the time for various reasons, but sometimes unprovoked and without cause. And how often are we hearing of mothers and fathers too, but mothers abusing, abandoning, or even killing their children? So some say that we're at our first death as a species, where we're starting to decline. However, there is a big, big difference between Universe 25 and the world that we are living in. As a species, our material needs of food, water, and housing, they're not being met. There may be enough food to feed everyone in the world, but the way it's distributed, the lack of money to obtain it, or other barriers, we have people that are starving. We know this, right? You have people that are homeless. They don't have shelter. You have people that don't have access to clean drinking water. We have predators. Humans may be at the top of the food chain, but you know what? If I'm walking on a mountainside and get attacked by a mountain lion, we have disease. We have harsh weather. Hurricanes going on right now. We are not living in a utopia like these mice were. So because all these needs for us as humans are not being met, I know it's going to sound weird, but bear with me. This may be actually, according to John's experiment, help give purpose to the human race to work together and survive as a species. That roles are not going, the roles are not being filled because as humans die off, more humans come in to fill those roles. So it's a constant kind of motion thing. So due to John's work in this area, He ended up dabbling in like city planning in his later years in order to plan city layouts to increase social interaction in humans and not like avoid it. So like he created conceptual spaces that were filled with like creativity and artistry, and they weren't built around like social hierarchies. So if you think about like a building where, the more towards the top is the penthouse and then the lower floors are the poor people, he made that where it's not social hierarchy. John then even formed, he took this overcrowding thing seriously. He even formed what was called the Space Cadets. This mission of this group was to look at creating colonies on other planets to avoid overcrowding Earth. The problem with John's work at the time in the late 60s when all this happened, early 70s, was that, everybody was fascinated by this stuff, but they wanted to hear more about what caused this decline in the mice Utopia or the diagnosis or whatever, and they didn't want to talk about the cure, like what can be done to prevent this in humans, right? So because of this, like John eventually lost his funding and he ended up retiring in 1986, and then he later died in 1995. John's work is still talked about today. It's been estimated that the world's human population could be as much as 9.6 billion by the year 2050. But the conversation has shifted from humans' basic survival in an overcrowded population to what if one day the number of humans outweigh the number of jobs available on Earth? With technology, we've seen jobs be replaced by computers, AI, and even the consumer themselves. How many of you use self-checkout or use one of those order boards at McDonald's? Yeah. Jobs, of course, can give a person a purpose, a role, and if there are no jobs to fill in the society, would that be the ultimate downfall? What do you think? Now, in closing, I want to tell you something very interesting, that a short time after Universe 25 started in the late 60s, a writer named Robert O'Brien visited John Calhoun and got to see Universe 25 in person. Robert, the author, noticed a Frisbee hanging on the wall and asked John about it, like, well, what's that Frisbee doing in the mouse Utopia? John told him that it was for times of stress, when things got stressful, and the staff would then like toss the Frisbee back and forth just to kind of relieve the stress and relax a bit. So Robert O'Brien then went on to write the book, Ms. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim. If you don't know what this book is, it's a story about rats who escaped from a lab and attempted to create their own utopia in the wild. Then in 1982, The Secret of Nim, an animated movie, was created. I loved that movie. I watched it so many times as a kid, and now I want to go watch it again. So what are your thoughts on this whole experiment? How do you think it relates to humans? Do you think the human race is on a path to follow this outcome? Do you think we are in our first death? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Thank you, everyone, for sticking with me while I went through this short little hiatus. But I do have my new computer. And not to worry, my old computer is not sitting collecting dust. A new hard drive was put in her, and I gave it to my brother for his birthday so he could continue his YouTube channel. It's called B-rad's Outdoors. I'll put the link in the description. He does more fishing stuff and things like that. So anyway, any suggestions, please send them my way. Put them in the comments, email me, message me, however, on social media, and we will get these stories going. If I can, I will try to catch up and do a story next week too, but I can't promise anything. Okay, I'll let you guys know. But thank you so much, and I will see you again next video. Bye.